Let's begin today by pondering a few things. First, a scenario. A man is walking past a large hospital when he sees a physician in a white coat and a little girl coming toward him. As they come closer, he realizes the physician is an old friend whom he has not seen since their college days. They greet each other warmly, and the friend says, "Since we last saw each other in college, I went on to medical school, and I am now a surgeon at this hospital. I am also married, someone whom you don't know and have never met, and this is our daughter, Nancy." The man says to the little girl, "Nancy, you not only have your mother's name, but you also have her brown eyes." How did he know this? Actually, this is not a very tough question. It's only perplexing if we have presumed that the doctor or surgeon of whom we speak is a male. However, it was never stated that the doctor was a male. And why must all doctors be males? Now, perhaps you have avoided this presumption. Yet many students, both male and female, make the presumption when asked this question that the doctor must have been a man. Why do so many find it natural to presume that the doctor must have been a man? Next question. In the English language, the term man has often been used in a gender-neutral way to refer to the human race as a whole. Similarly, he and his have often been used to refer to any individual. Is this okay, or is it problematic? What do you think? Third, suppose we have an ancient philosopher who has been extremely influential in the history of ideas in the Western knowledge tradition. Yet suppose this philosopher held that it was better to be born male than female. Now, that could mean different things, but let's just suppose that by this he meant not simply that men have it better, but that men are superior to women. My question is this: does this warrant rejecting everything else that the philosopher has said and contributed to the history of ideas? Does he lose authority and credibility on the other stuff that he said if he's wrong on this issue? Or is it possible to be wrong on one issue and still be right on others? Aristotle, for example, evidently held an unfortunately low view of women. While he believed that the good life in society was impossible unless women and men were both happy, he nevertheless seems to have viewed women as more emotional and impulsive and deceptive than men, and therefore warranting less authority than males. Ought we then to reject the entire Aristotelian tradition because it perpetuates patriarchy? Or ought we simply to reject what he said as it relates to any prescriptions concerning how we should view gender, while gleaning what we can from other areas of Aristotelian thought, since he wrote on many things which were non-gender specific? A final prefacing point to ponder comes from William Lawhead's The Philosophical Journey. He writes, "If you are female, what things do you think males just don't understand? Why do you suppose this? If you are a male, what things do you think females just don't understand, and why do you suppose this? Are there situations that evoke distinctively male and female ways of looking at things? If so, how should this fact be taken into account when constructing a theory of knowledge?" Now, we left off with the question of scientific knowledge, and I mentioned that historically there was a schism between two schools of thought, what has come to be known as the analytic tradition and what is known as the continental tradition. I also mentioned that the analytic tradition has been more accepting and asserting as it relates to the authority of science to speak of truth and knowledge, whereas the continental tradition has, generally speaking, carried a greater sense of skepticism when it comes to really any kind of claim to objective universal knowledge and truth, science included. Now we begin with this overview because we are speaking of postmodern things today, but we begin with feminism. Now feminism is not necessarily postmodern. However, we really needed to begin with this distinction between the two schools because the continental influences on feminism show up a lot in postmodern thought. Please keep in mind that feminism is a robust area of philosophical investigation, and we are limited to a brief and broad survey. A primer meant to target core questions specifically regarding epistemology. Feminism raises many questions worth pondering and offers much food for thought. We are targeting the epistemic question of perspective and the metaphysical question of identity. Now, feminism is such a broad topic with a rich history and a series of sub-distinctions and approaches and methodology. So I want to be careful to clarify our purpose here and situate it within the dialogue that we've been having for a few weeks. So in light of our continuing discussion on truth as correspondence versus truth as coherence, we are specifically targeting core truth and knowledge claims unique to certain traditions and the intertwining of traditions within contemporary movements. So our survey is going to be understandably superficial and pointed. We will not be addressing all areas of feminism and all concerns. Feminism entails a variety of questions concerning epistemology, as well as a variety of ideas as to what justice might look like within society. When it comes to the claims of feminism, then, our emphasis is not upon various ethical questions concerning the mistreatment of women, nor upon issues of inequality or entitlement per se, but rather upon core epistemic claims accompanying two broad traditions or schools of feminist thought: the significance of perspective and the claim that gender is constructed, and how these relate to other contemporary movements. Please understand that movements or waves refer to periods of time, and any given time period includes a complexity of perspectives. So when one describes a movement or wave, this is not to say that everyone that championed related ideals or ideas within any given time identified with that wave, nor that the movement adequately represents the majority of perspectives of the time. For instance, some feminists within what we will call the second wave may have advocated for certain economic political rights while also disagreeing with some of the claims of the rising radical wave. That is to say, when we speak of the second wave, it should not be assumed that all second wave feminists were radical feminists. Some may have described themselves simply as liberal feminists, exploring new avenues of what it means to be equal, or reacting against new issues of inequality or mistreatment. Others may have identified with certain aspects of these two perspectives without championing either position in its entirety. Additionally, we will only speak of two waves, but some people, when referring to the history of feminist thought, will point out multiple waves. So please understand that we are not really talking about all the various movements and new waves of ideas across various decades concerning the differences in approaching what justice for women in society might look like at that time. Our concern involves two epistemic traditions in feminist thought that are united in some central assertions and divided on other points. These two foundational perspectives have remained in tension throughout the history of feminism. Finally, within any movement, one often finds sub-movements. So it should not be assumed that we are speaking for all perspectives, nor all areas of emphases within any given movement. For example, some who consider themselves feminist, meaning that their main concern is to protect women from injustice, may focus primarily on developing things like crisis centers, rather than emphasizing the transformation of social structures and institutions. So again, our emphasis in this shallow primer on epistemological perspectives involves core claims on truth and knowledge and essence specifically. We are by no means speaking exhaustively of the complex history and philosophical tradition of feminist thought. So generally speaking, feminism refers to a philosophical movement that emphasizes the role of gender in shaping how society is structured, focuses on the historical and social forces that have excluded women from full participation in the intellectual and political realms, and strives to produce a society that recognizes women and men as both different and equal. Now, some within one particular strand of feminism might prefer the phrasing that recognizes all genders or gender identities as different and equal. Two presumptions to address quickly. First, it's not the case that all females identify as feminists, especially given some of the more controversial epistemological claims that arise with the second wave. Some women may choose to distance themselves, whether from stereotypes or from the ideals themselves associated with the ism. Nor is it the case that male philosophers cannot be feminists. To be feminist is to agree with the general tenets of feminism. There were two broad waves of feminism. Now I have to be careful here because people commonly refer to three waves, and it could be argued that we are amidst the fourth now. However, the third and the fourth really grow out of the second, and so it's really important to understand the second wave. The first wave is called liberal feminism or equity feminism. It began in the mid-1800s and continued on into the mid-1900s. It stressed individual freedom and opportunity. Women should have full intellectual and political participation in society, so suffrage was a core concern. However, on this perspective, the basic social structures and intellectual traditions of Western history are valuable and should be retained. But let's see and study and celebrate more women contributors. In addition to winning the right to vote, there was also a concern for other avenues of equal opportunity, and perhaps World War II helped to that end. While there was definitely a differential treatment concerning pay, with so many males enlisting in the war, by 1945, I think something like 1 in 4 married women worked outside the home. The second wave began in the 60s and really pushed on to the turn of the century. It was more radical in nature. Sometimes it's called radical feminism, sometimes gender feminism. This wave stressed the perspective that the fundamental structures of Western society are male-dominated distortions. These are built upon socially oppressive ideologies. Western views of truth are oppressive and must be deconstructed. Now, this wave really happened alongside other civil rights movements, and so there was a sense of solidarity between multiple oppressed parties. The radical wave stressed sexuality and reproductive rights. This wave protested beauty pageants as manifestations of patriarchal domination, meat markets that reduce women to objects, sexualized objects. And so there was a backlash against sexualization. Things like bras or high heels or expecting women to wear lipstick, these things could be considered oppressive. This wave was influenced by existentialism as well as neo-Marxism. Concerning the latter, it associated the oppression of women not only with patriarchy, but with capitalism and heterosexual norms, as well as expectations concerning the role of a wife and mother. It was this wave that separated sex from gender, asserting that sex is biological, but gender is socially constructed. It varies between cultures. Now, given our interests, this is a claim on knowledge, an epistemological claim. Now, don't misunderstand me here. The claim that gender roles, norms, or expectations are or can be shaped by social structures or historical narratives or traditions is one thing. And sometimes when people speak of a separation between sex and gender, this is what they are appealing to. To go beyond this separation, however, and to say, as we will see, that there is no essence to gender, that is, that there is no essential connection between gender and bodily sex or biology. Well, now that's an entirely different epistemic claim. Now, most people would not push back against the former. We do see across different times in history and across different cultures that gender roles or expectations can look different in different contexts. The latter claim, however, although it is more widely accepted and asserted in contemporary times, is a significant point of division. First, one might ask why think that the latter necessarily follows from the former. Second, some would argue that only a biologically female body is able to give birth, to conceive life, and only a biologically male body is able to give seed that will result in new life. Thus, it may be the case that gender roles or norms or expectations are socially constructed or socially determined, contextually dependent, yet an empirical study of nature suggests that there is something unique about the nature of femaleness and the nature of maleness, and that such uniqueness directly involves the embodied biological being. So you can probably already begin to see why this epistemic tradition, certain claims within the second wave, are going to cause ripples in the pond, so to speak, that are still rocking our boat of debate and causing points of division in contemporary thought. It is worth considering that the same claim has been made about morality, that morality is a social construction that varies from society to society, so there is no ultimate morality. Given the sense of solidarity I mentioned between feminists of this wave and other minorities oppressed, other civil rights movements of the time, feminism here began to see race, class, and gender oppression as all being connected. There was a third wave associated with the 1990s. Although it grew out of the second wave, in some ways it was a backlash to the second wave, whereas the second wave had taken issue with the sexualization of women as objects and reacted against things like high heels and push-up bras and expectations of wearing lipstick and things like this. This wave embraced such sexualization as symbolic of overthrowing oppression through the assertion of their femininity as a form of empowerment. Similarly, there was a sort of what some have called a rhetoric of mimicry, where previously offensive terms like slut or bitch are recontextualized as a symbol of power and ownership of those terms. You cannot oppress me with that which is mine, was the idea. This wave also embraced a further skewing of gender binaries, which set the stage for the next wave. Contemporary feminism of the 2000 teens, which some have called the fourth wave, continued to explore avenues of oppression and justice for women, but in many ways seemingly began to focus less on justice and equality for women per se, but rather advocates for the equality of genders, or defends against the oppression of genders, and especially sees gender on the spectrum. Central to this contemporary wave is the significance of perspective, especially the idea of intersectionality, and this grows out of a tradition known as feminist standpoint theory, whereas the traditional Western approach, the analytic approach, has been to think that we all have access to objective truth and knowledge, and we can rationalize that down and all get to truth. Well, standpoint theory suggests that all we ever have really are our standpoints. And so we have our own perspective relating to our own unique experiences, and until we bring that to the dialogue and talk about our differing perspectives, we don't really have an understanding of truth or knowledge. So in this sense, we don't really have an access to a unique, objective, overarching truth. Rather, we only have our standpoint, and we can bring that to the table. And together, we are involved in a dialectical process, and we eventually work our way to truth. So truth is like an evolving progress. The idea is this: only one who has been oppressed or marginalized or been at the receiving end of injustice understands what that is like. So to get closer to a true understanding of justice, is it something to be rationalized downward, or should we hear from the experiences of those who believe that they have been treated unjustly or oppressed? Additionally, some claim that until there is an awareness or acknowledgement of potential oppression within a culture, those who feel discriminated against have no language with which to express their feelings of discrimination. So if, for example, a culture does not believe that there exist harmful discriminations within that culture, then those who feel themselves to be victims of harmful discrimination have no credible language with which to express their feelings of victimization. Now, according to the idea of intersectionality, only a minority that is oppressed can understand oppression. So the more oppressed you are, because you have layers of minority oppression, the more qualified you are to speak of oppression. Now, we'll come back to this, but this means that the one most qualified to speak of truth or knowledge is the one with the largest number of minority perspectives. If you have only one perspective and it is not a minority oppressed perspective, never mind a layering of perspectives, then you are going to be least qualified to speak of knowledge. Relatedly, this contemporary wave continues to normalize sexualization and further skew social expectations concerning gender binaries. This has caused tension between various schools of feminist thought. Some feminists would argue that the less you see femininity or womanness as distinct and special, the less significance you can place on femininity and what it means to be a woman. This brings us to an important distinction. Some feminists are essentialists. For them, gender characteristics must be understood as fixed. Female nature is to be celebrated as part of female biology. Others are non-essentialists. They are existentialists. For them, gender characteristics are not fixed in any way. The idea of women's nature is itself a social construct that prevents women from possessing the freedom to redefine themselves. In the words of Simone de Beauvoir, one of France's most celebrated 20th century writers and an influential voice in the feminist movement, one is not born, but rather becomes a woman. And we'll talk about existentialism soon enough, but this becoming is all over existentialism. However, the question with any talk of social construct is, are we back to relativism? If so, then it's going to be difficult to advance any perspective like that of feminism as good or right or true or meaningful, because these things are just social constructs, right? Although there are many divisions and disagreements within feminism as a school of thought, all areas of feminist theory tend to take issue with the belief that there is one universal human nature, and with the idea that knowledge is gained in isolation, that is removed from social context. William Lawhead explains the first point, which he calls the generic humanity assumption, in this way. The picture of one universal human nature has been created by taking men's experiences and psychology as the paradigm. Other points of view and models of humanity have been excluded. What seems to be a core doctrine foundational to the subdiscipline of feminism as a whole is that males and females offer distinct but equally valuable natures, and perspective is contextual. You see according to where you are. As it relates to epistemology, all that you know is tethered to what you have experienced. Now, while many postmodern feminists do embrace relativism, the view that truth is not absolute, that rather it is the shifting product of social contexts, cultural conventions, and individual redefinition, that is, truth is cultural construct, many feminist epistemologists refuse to accept relativism because they understand that doing so would undermine and trivialize the entire value and project of feminism. And that is as far as we are really able to go today into that school of thought. It is existentialism and other postmodern schools of thought influenced by the continental tradition to which we now turn. We will consider existentialism more in depth when we get to the module on free will, but because existentialist thinking is all over postmodern epistemology, we've got to consider it this week. Now, the roots of existentialist thought really go back to the Romanticism. Recall that Romanticism stressed individualism, the significance of subjective experience, and personal meaning, even if it cannot be rationalized. Existentialists are plagued by the question of life's absurdity. Life seems absurd. Where is the meaning? So what do we conclude? Although many existentialists are also atheists, not all are. The father of existentialist thought, Søren Kierkegaard, was a theist. Meaning is something non-material, and so in the material realm, there is only absurdity. Because meaning within absurdity is a contradiction, it cannot be rationalized. So it is only when we are willing to take a leap of faith beyond the futility of the material realm in order to rest in God, there, and only there, we find meaningfulness, and we are able to escape the anxiety and the hopelessness which represents all we find down here. Now recall that for the Romantics, if a higher sense of meaningfulness cannot be rationalized, then we must take a leap of faith to embrace the irrational. For the longing for meaning is one of the most obvious aspects of humanity. Following Kierkegaard, Friedrich Nietzsche gives us a secular answer to the question of life's absurdity. He embraces life's absurdity. This is called nihilism. There is no meaning. But he rejects ideas of objective truth like telos, there is a way it's supposed to be, or a purpose to the world or to your life or identity, and ideas of God. He says that these things are weak-minded faithlessness in self. According to Nietzsche, God is dead, meaning that we've reached an age in which we progressed to the point that we no longer need to rest on religious ideals, which he would consider a crutch or even a sickness. For Nietzsche, life is absurd. But if life is absurd, there's nothing stopping us from asserting our own truth. And if God is dead, then we are free. So we create our own truth. We assert our own identity, and we assert our own meaning onto our experiences. By the time we reach the 20th century, many are pushing away from Western tradition and the things of Western tradition, God, religion, higher truths. These were previously understood as stable, and so now, with the crumbling sense of Western structures, there is a growing sense of anxiety as to how one can ground any sense of real meaning in the face of life's absurdity. World War had destroyed the optimism that human beings were progressing toward truth, freedom, and political stability. While some saw the horrors of war as testimony to the fact of a higher truth that makes evil intelligible, for many who had already rejected the possibility of such appeals, the world wars only further dismantled any hope to be found within the idea of an objective truth concerning human goodness, scientific authority, and future progress. The tradition of philosophy itself, especially metaphysics, was under heavy attack from empiricism during this time. As prior structures of authority and ideals of objective truth continued to weaken, individual autonomy or freedom seemed to remain as the only legitimate shelter to which one might turn. And even the idea of individual free will was challenged by empiricism. For the existentialists, individual experience is too complex to be reduced to any sort of logical rationalistic proofs or scientific verifications that can exhaustively comprehend subjectivity. It also rejected the classical view of essentialism. Essentialism gives priority to identity or purpose or telos over subjective experience. However, the scientific trap of empiricism reduces the person to behavior or environment, external stimuli, or their sense experience. And the philosophical trap of the rationalist tradition reduces the person to mere definitions. There is no room for the I of which Descartes spoke. For the existentialists, my existence defines me. I am nothing other than my own conscious existence. I determine my own essence. I determine my own identity. So there is no fixed telos, no way I'm supposed to be, no predetermined I. I am the sole source of whatever truth, meaning, or purpose my world has. No essence defines me, nor should I allow it to do so. We should therefore reject all scientific, religious, or philosophical assertions and political prescriptions that attempt to prescribe the identity I ought to embrace or the existence I ought to experience. In the words of Albert Camus, the meaning of life is whatever keeps you from killing yourself. The most famous existentialist of the 20th century, whom we will meet soon, was Jean-Paul Sartre, and his non-traditional open relationship person was Simone de Beauvoir, whom you now know was a significant influence in second-wave feminism. Okay, let's move on with our very superficial overview of postmodernism. If postmodernism is the deep end of the swimming pool, then we are really just sitting on the steps with our floaties on, with our legs in the water. But as messy as postmodernism is, and as shallow as our primer here may be, we've got to have some kind of grasp of the concepts that are influencing our culture. There are several schools of thought, and we can't address them all, but we will hit some of the highlights that come together to influence us. So next we have Jacques Derrida and the movement of deconstruction. This movement stressed that there is no real meaning beyond our language. Meaning is the product of convention and language games. Now this means that any appeals to higher objective truths or fixed binaries or a way it should be, all of this kind of stuff we need to just get rid of, take it out of the language, because if language is just the product of convention, then nothing is fixed. It's all socially constructed. Now, I'm getting ahead of myself, but if that's the case, then asserting higher truths, as a matter of fact, or appealing to fixed binaries or telos, then really this is just a sort of oppression through language. A power play. Michel Foucault suggested that our claims to knowledge are actually forms of oppression or power play. Suspicious of meta-narratives, a narrative tells a story, well, a meta-narrative involves a bigger story. This would include the way things are, the way things ought to be. So suspicious of these meta-narrative claims relating to objective truth or knowledge or even history itself, Foucault argues that if meaning is constructed by culture, then our claims on objective truth and knowledge and history are really just power plays. History merely amounts to a discourse of power, as the powerful assert claims of truth and knowledge over the weak. So we are told what is true, how things are, and what we ought to believe, and this is really just a form of control. So, again, I'm getting ahead of myself. We are oppressed and don't even know it. We are oppressed to the claims of our knowledge traditions. The new wave of pragmatism focused on the nature of language, arguing that our language is never actually able to grasp the nature of things. Though we have these different languages like theology and science and politics, etc., that try to speak of reality, none of them are actually able to grasp reality. So we should really put the question of reality out of mind. Rather than asking which of our vocabularies gets it right, we should ask which language is most useful. Since we are never really in a position to know or prove whether a belief is actually true, all we can really do is determine whether it meets certain standards of acceptance, whether it is endorsed, even if only for a short time, by the community. This is clearly a form of relativism. There is no real truth, there's only agreement, whatever works. In the words of Richard Rorty, truth is whatever your colleagues let you get away with.
After Darwin, it becomes very hard to say that human beings grasp the true nature of things. It's much easier to say they've developed language to enable them to serve various ends, better food, better sex, better shelter, more interesting lives, and so on, as opposed to doing this thing called knowing what things in themselves really are. So after Darwin, the pragmatists in America and Nietzsche in Europe said, don't ask the question, which language gets reality right? Just ask the question, which language serves what human purpose best? And presumably human beings will need lots and lots of languages because they've got lots and lots of purposes. The philosophical tradition asked questions like, which language is closer to the way things are, the language of theology, the language of natural science, the language of common sense, the language of politics, poetic language, and so on. After Nietzsche and the pragmatists, people stopped asking questions of that sort, or at least the pragmatists encouraged them to stop asking questions of that sort. And this meant dropping the distinction between reality and appearance and saying, we don't need to ask which language is closer to reality, we just need to ask what a given language enables us to do that other languages don't enable us to do. The language of quantum mechanics enables us to build bombs. We couldn't have done that without that particular language. The literary language of the European literary tradition enables us to write poems in a way that we couldn't write poems before, and so on. But one way of thinking of it is that the poems aren't closer than the physicists' theories to reality, and we can just put the question of relation to reality out of our minds.
Okay, so now we reach the can of worms that is this amalgamation of intersecting ideologies, known as critical theory. Some might call it cultural Marxism. It did grow out of neo-Marxism, but many who advocate a form of critical theory may not necessarily buy into Marxism or may not even know of the origins in connection to Marxism. And so if you call someone a cultural Marxist, sometimes it just comes across as name-calling. Even if you've never heard the term critical theory, you are likely well familiar with the ideology of critical social justice. So first of all, let me clarify that the history of the critical theory tradition entails both ideology and methodology. A critical methodology is an epistemological investigation into certain established ideas of the times or traditions, narratives, that make claims on truth and knowledge. So we could be critically analyzing the claims of rationalists or empiricists, or, as it applies to sociocultural, political institutions and systems and things like this, a critical theorist might be interested in investigating whether, and if so, to what extent, certain ideas or assumptions or biases might have marginalized other perspectives. In this strict sense, as a methodology, the critical theorist is interested in investigating and uncovering potential injustices and exposing others either to unique perspectives from within certain lived experiences or to certain norms, ideas, teachings, and traditions, that is, hegemonic powers or social, cultural, ideological, or economic influences exerted by the dominant group, and the question of whether such power and influence either inappropriately marginalize or suppress in such a way that it begins to unjustly oppress other minority perspectives if we're talking epistemology, or values and freedoms if we're talking ethics. Now, as a methodology, critical theory approaches cultural claims on truth much like Socrates scrutinized the truth assumptions of his day. So as a methodology, as a tool of inquiry and investigation, critical theory is valuable and admirable in its seeming concern for all perspectives and in its effort to keep the dialogue open. It begins to pick up criticism, however, as it begins to teeter away from methodology and toward ideology. If it is presumed that mainstream ideologies must necessarily be wrong because they marginalize other perspectives, especially if we're talking about ethics, well, that's a problematic and controversial claim. Now, it's really important to understand the critic on this point. Their concern is perspective and not persons. That is, they can agree that we should not treat people unjustly simply because we disagree with them or we do not share the same value structures or ideals of the good life with them, or even the same worldview foundations. Where the critic disagrees is with the subtle transition from saying that we should value all persons to saying that this means valuing all perspectives, in particular, all claims to moral truth. Cultures are naturally built around what is valued, and cultures naturally celebrate what they value. As you celebrate what you value, you naturally ignore what you find less interesting. You value a certain sort of music, and if there are types of music that you just don't like, you probably don't just walk around listening to them. This also seems to be natural to the process of forming our own sense of identity. To begin to see ourselves more clearly as we question who we are, we tend to draw lines and understand what we are not. So in many ways, we tend to understand ourselves more in terms of the other. So in one sense, a marginalization of value is natural, but it can also become problematic. If a culture does not value women's perspectives or the perspectives of a racial minority within that culture, this does not mean that those human beings have no place in the dialogue, or that their culture should be extinguished and they should be expected to adopt the mainstream culture's values and perspectives. However, things get a little stickier when you move beyond speaking about perspective or race and humanity and culture per se and begin to speak of ethics. That is, perspectives or truth claims on moral value. Your ethics are largely determined by your hierarchy of values. And your hierarchy of values is determined according to your worldview. And your worldview involves basic core assumptions about the way the world is. These are core epistemological and metaphysical assumptions, like whether or not there is a God, or whether or not there is an objective universal moral truth binding on all people across all cultures throughout history. When you disagree on such foundational assumptions, you are going to end up with major points of contention. Here, the analytic thinker will push back. You've got to be able to ground your claims to truth and justice before telling other people how they ought to act. Life and nature are full of inconveniences. We can seek to understand multiple perspectives, and we can feel bad for some people who have gone through certain things. And we can agree that greater perspective is good, and perhaps even that society will be better if we are able to show a greater appreciation for diversity, as long as it does not inconvenience us. That last part is powerful. If you've taken any ethics class, you know that it is very hard to ground that claim to ought. It all goes back to your worldview narrative. Just because you say so doesn't make it so. And however nice one's ideals of an eventual social utopia might be, or ideals of what justice might look like, peace, love, harmony, and all that, if one's worldview is unable to ground one's definitions of injustice and justice, and one's objective universal truth claims and ethical prescriptions for action, then there is really no rational force to compel the rational being that they ought to act in any sort of way. There is an emotional force, yet it is that rational part of us that is so central to what makes a human being, right? So why would we let the emotional part of us, which is shared with all animals, be what drives our ethics? For that can lead to all sorts of problems. Now, not all advocates of critical theory advance or embrace relativism, please understand that. In fact, many would quickly point out that they do believe that there is a truth, but it's not the sort of thing that we can have right now without having considered all perspectives. Therefore, it's the sort of thing that we have to work our way toward and may eventually arrive at. And perhaps this is correct, some analytic thinkers might respond, when it comes to certain things like scientific understanding and what political, social structures work best for the greatest number of people. But when it comes to claims on moral truth, there is a unique risk involved. For ethical narratives, by nature, marginalize contrary perspectives, and moral binaries are unavoidable. Now, critical theory is sensitive to binaries, particularly us, them, the normal, and the other. Now, this is really a social binary, and there may be something to that, but it's difficult to push back against the idea of moral binaries because the moment you say you should, or that is justice, or that is wrong, you've made a claim on truth. Either you're true or you're wrong. And if that is a moral truth, either we ought to respect it or not. So again, ethical narratives by nature marginalize contrary perspectives. If it is in fact wrong to hurt or kill people for the fun of it, then we will marginalize or even oppress those people in society who want to hurt or kill people for the fun of it. Here, oppression would be in the form of telling them they can't do that, or punishing them if they did. Now that's a point where the critical theorist and the continental thinker is really concerned, because before we punish someone for doing something that we call wrong, we better be sure that we understand what is wrong. And this is why the multiple perspectives and continuing dialogue is so important to the critical theorist. Again, what the analytic thinker will take issue with is the question of whether you simply reject the mainstream traditional perspective simply because it says that some views are wrong. So again, there is a difference between epistemology and ethics. In the same way that we can have a society that is plural in its ideas, you can believe in one God, he can believe in another, and she can believe that there is no God. You can believe that it's never okay to hurt someone for the fun of it. She can believe that it's sometimes okay to hurt people for the fun of it. It depends on the circumstance. And he might believe that not only is it okay for him to hurt people for the fun of it, but there is not really any reason as to why he couldn't or shouldn't do so, except for those oppressive laws. Now, these are just contrary beliefs, and we can all live together holding our contrary beliefs, our different values. However, when it comes to issues of ethics in particular, We cannot necessarily live in a margin-free society. For any position we take, even the position, let each do what is right in his or her own eyes, will inevitably lead to some sort of marginalization, value suppression, or injustice. So there's a lot to the tradition of critical theory. There is value in the methodology, and it is the ideology, if adopted, which causes points of tension. And those points of tension tend to show up within contemporary debates over ideas concerning social justice. While social justice really just means seeking justice in society, and there are long-standing traditions of seeking goodness within society that date well before postmodernism, and since you can't apply justice to society without understanding what justice is, the question of what is justice is one of the oldest and most important questions in the history of philosophy. Some critical theorists, however, having moved beyond descriptive methodology in order to assert prescriptive ideology, define social justice for us in a very particular way relating directly to many of the ideological influences that we've covered here today. Since there is no ultimate truth to be known, and therefore no ultimate thing to be valued, and therefore no overarching universal, objective, moral truth that bears prescriptions for how we ought to go about living our lives, then oppression comes in the form of one group's narrative concerning truth and value and morality being asserted as true and imposed upon others by denying them certain freedoms or privileges or condemning certain lifestyles as wrong or bad. Since the power narrative of the majority view is imposed upon minority perspectives through sociocultural value hierarchies and institutional systems, and also through the power of media influence, justice then means liberating the oppressed, the marginalized perspectives. Liberating them from what? Well, from the moral censorship of the oppressor group's truth and value narrative. This is critical social justice, which is the social justice emphasis of the critical theory ideology. As well as other theories we've not had time to discuss, critical theory is a coalescing of neo-Marxist thought, second-wave feminist theory with its intertwining with critical race theory, gender studies, queer theory, and others. Other theories of oppression and liberation ideologies, even liberation theology. Nietzsche's perspectivism, there is no overarching truth but only perspectives. As well as his master-slave morality, in which the true masters are the oppressed, those who are brave enough to assert their own truths onto the world and be masters of their own fate, while the slaves represent the mainstream herd, enslaved as it is to false notions of higher truths, moral, teleological, and religious ideals. Michel Foucault's idea of power over language, or the cultural narrative, asserted through claims on knowledge and truth and history. The idea that claims on truth and value and morality and binaries is all just a social construct. There's also some existentialist influence, as well as NeoPragmatic influence, with the idea that truth amounts to whatever is determined by acceptance of the minority group in the immediate sense, and the group of scholars, specifically sociologists, in the ultimate sense, as critical theory grew out of the philosophy of social science. There are other and many influences, but we can narrow them down to these. From Marxist origins, we have the development of a philosophy of social science known as critical theory. Whereas Marx had stressed oppression through economic hardship, Neo-Marxism, foundational to critical theory, expands Marxist ideology to include oppression through other factors such as social norms or customs or any other kind of manifestation of power within the political realm or institutional structures. It evolved to include a complex network of critical social theories, and this is why it's so messy to pin down. Critical theory in its origins was modernist, and since it has evolved, it has taken on many postmodern influences. So if you really start looking deeply, you can find places where there is postmodern agreement and postmodern disagreement. The existentialist assertion that there is no telos, no moral ought to be, no way it is concerning values or morality, no epistemic ought to know, no way it is concerning knowledge tradition and truth narratives. One core tenet of contemporary critical theory is the feminist assertion of intersectionality, that perspective equals knowledge. So the more perspective you have, specifically the more perspective you have as a member of an oppressed group, then the more qualified you are to speak of what truth and knowledge may be or may entail. Now, the emphasis on multiple perspectives is an important one. That's a core concern of higher education. But this aspect of feminist thought, coming from the tradition known as standpoint theory, says more than this. On this view, knowledge is tethered to perspective, and those who hold to a mainstream view, which holds the power, really only have one unchallenged perspective, while there are a plethora of minority perspectives out there. If knowledge is tethered to perspective, then the one with the most knowledge is the one who has the greatest access to a variety of perspectives. Foucault's discourse of power is quite influential. As we've seen, morality just amounts to power play, but power is not economic as it was with Marxism. Rather, power is epistemic. By seizing control of the language, the oppressor group seizes control of knowledge, therefore seizing control of the narrative. Thus, injustice means oppression, which means being told that there is and ought to be a proper knowledge or value or morality or lifestyle that ought to be accepted. Now here's the tactful move. It's kind of sneaky. You are either an oppressor or you're oppressed. Either you are an oppressor and you assert this, or if you are a member of a minority group and you agree with the oppressor's narrative, then you have internalized that oppression. So on the one side, either you are an oppressor or you have a sort of Stockholm syndrome for your oppressor, or on the other side, you are a woke advocate of overthrowing the oppression. Wokeness refers to an epistemic enlightenment, to see things as they really are, which means to see things through the lens of oppressor-oppression, to understand that justice equals liberation, and liberation equals the rejection of mainstream or traditional value narratives, structures, institutions, and a key controversial point, justice equals the affirmation of all oppressed, that is, marginalized, perspectives. Now here's the thing, all cultures have a mainstream view, and that is what the culture values. And by definition, to emphasize what you value is to de-emphasize what you don't. Add to this the complexity of morality. If there is reason to believe in moral truth, then it would make sense to marginalize that which is believed to be wrong. So this is a complex issue, to be sure. Now let's pause for a moment for clarification. This lecture is so deep and broad that it can also become superficial. So let me clarify that because critical theory involves an intersection in itself of people coming from different places, concerned with different things, but also advancing different solutions, I need to be careful here to clarify. When we talk about justice in society, some critical theorists might be concerned with equity, while others are more concerned with equality, and these are not necessarily the same thing. Some might be concerned with seeking social and political equal opportunities based on merit. Look at my qualifications, not my skin or gender or personal lifestyle, etc. Others might be seeking social and political equal opportunities based on equal distribution of representation. don't look at the qualifications of employees per se, but make sure that you have an equally distributed number of ages, races, genders, etc. represented. Each of those individuals should be qualified, but overall, the concern is with the spread of representation rather than giving all jobs to those who deserve it most based on merit. The same question arises not only with employment, but also with other things like financial aid or acceptance when it comes to higher education. For some critical theorists, justice in society might involve seeking freedom to choose one's own cultural or value preferences without fear of harmful discriminations. Some seek a greater sense of affirmation that all human beings share a common humanity and that despite lifestyle preference or perspective or differences in race or gender, we should be fair and just concerning a certain sense of dignity due all of humanity. And some critical theorists specifically seek cultural and sociopolitical affirmation, not of basic human dignity per se, but of all, especially marginalized, moral values. And that's really one of the epistemic claims that we're taking issue with here. Obviously, some of these claims are less controversial, and some of them are more controversial. The two most controversial being the claim that social political privileges should be distributed according to representation rather than merit, and most controversially, the idea that justice means the affirmation and celebration of all moral value perspectives. So in overlooking some of the less controversial claims, though still relevant questions, let us not assume that all who are concerned with a critical investigation of justice in society are necessarily and purposefully advancing these more controversial points. But it is these more controversial points of epistemic tension with which we are particularly concerned during our study of epistemology. Now we've got to think more about this variable of intersectionality, so here's a quick video.
There are many different types of discrimination, including things like discrimination based on sex, gender, culture, race, and other factors. And we can often consider these things in isolation. But what happens when someone experiences multiple forms of discrimination at the same time? What happens when we have overlapping areas of discrimination? Well, one of the things that can happen is that we can have individuals in our society that have characteristics that can result in them facing discrimination in multiple different areas. For example, we can have a female who is of African American origin and who, for example, practices Buddhist teachings. And in a particular society within our country, that may cause her to be discriminated against in 3 different areas. So if we were to draw her circles of discrimination, what would her overlap look like? So she may have one overlap based on her sex or gender. She may have one overlap based on her racial or cultural identification. And she may have another circle based on her religious ideas. And right in the center, we have this level of extreme overlap, right at the intersection. Now, why is it important to consider this intersection of these 3 different areas? It's important because at this intersection, these multiple different categories of potential discrimination or oppression may compound and interplay in this one individual and really significantly put her at a disadvantage within society. And in order to understand the level of disadvantage that she has, we really need to understand all 3 of these factors. The theory of intersectionality really states just that. It really focuses on the point at which these multiple different areas of potential discrimination overlap with one another and exist alongside one another, and says that we really need to understand when all of these things coexist, because if we don't consider all of them at the same time, we really don't get to fully understand the situation. So in this individual, if we just consider the fact that she likes Buddhist teachings in a culture or society that really doesn't appreciate that, and we miss the fact that the society also doesn't appreciate the fact that she's female or discriminates against African Americans, we may not fully understand the level of discrimination that she faces. And the same situation would result if we only consider the fact that she was female in a sexist society, or that she was African American in a racist society. So this theory of intersectionality really asks us to consider all of the different levels of discrimination. Now, while the theory was originally coined in 1989 by Crenshaw as a feminist theory to explain the oppression of women, it has since really expanded out. And people have then really used it to explain oppression and discrimination found in all parts of society.
Now, critical theory has plenty of critics. There is no ought to be, and so justice, that which ought to be, is liberation, and we ought to seek justice. Something's not lining up. We ought to see things this way? Wokeness involves a way it ought to be seen? Can you have an ought to be and no ought to be at the same time? According to advocates of critical social justice, all oppression exists on binary terms. Us, them, the oppressor, the oppressed, the normal, the other. So this comes back to the idea that binaries are social constructs and therefore a power play. The irony is that critical theory itself exists on binary terms. There is a true-false binary. Either critical theory is correct or not, that is, either it has asserted something true about the world or not, and there is a moral binary, a right-wrong binary, the good and right and woke crowd that accept the prescriptions of critical theory, contra the others, the wrong and ignorant folk who deny it. Even some postmodernists critique critical theory. For example, critical theory takes issue with colonialism, the idea of imposing ideologies and cultural values and expectations upon other cultures that did not want them. But the postmodernist, who embraces relativism, might ask, is this not exactly what critical theory does? By seizing the influence of the media in order to publicly shame those who reject the values and expectations and ideologies contrary to the critical theory view? Or to use media to sell us certain ideologies, to show us what we ought to see and accept and embrace as normal? Is critical theory not colonizing us, so to speak, and trying to make us see things their way and value the things that they value and de-emphasize the things that we value as the mainstream culture? There is another problem. Suppose critical theory is correct. We should marginalize the mainstream perspective because mainstream perspectives oppress the marginalized. To be consistent, then, if everyone were to buy into critical theory, thus critical theory became the mainstream cultural presumption, wouldn't this mean that we ought then to begin working to overthrow critical theory because it marginalizes perspectives that don't agree with it? That is, it oppresses all the other views which it believes to be false and which believe it to be false. Is this inconsistent? A really interesting observation has come from philosopher Peter Boghossian. In an article called Welcome to Culture War 2.0, he describes Culture War 1.0 as a Christian-atheist debate over God's existence, in which both sides appeal to objective knowledge, to truth as corresponding to reality, and to reason. He then argues that Culture War 2.0 largely writes off any appeal to truth or knowledge and reason as Western oppression, and they opt to silence their opposition rather than actually debate. And I would add to silence shame, because many would challenge that one of the tactics of critical theory is to publicly shame through media or social media those who disagree with you. Boghossian writes, those people who accept the correspondence theory of truth agree on the traditional rules of engagement, discourse, debate, dialogue, and do not view intersectionality as a necessary model for getting to the truth. These include many liberal atheists and conservative Christians. Those on the other side do not subscribe to the correspondence theory of truth, believe speech should be shut down if it's hurtful or potentially harmful, and think intersectional transformative approaches are necessary to refashion systems. These people are also predominantly atheists and Christians, intersectional woke atheists and intersectional woke Christians. As a point of contact, I am a non-intersectional liberal atheist. If a conservative Christian believes Jesus walked on water and believes this either is or is not true for everyone regardless of race or gender, and if she values discourse and adheres to basic rules of engagement, then she is closer to my worldview than an atheist who believes race and gender play a role in determining objective truth, and that her opponents should not be allowed to air what she considers harmful views. That is what makes this great realignment of Culture War 2.0, a realignment of liberal atheism with conservative Christianity, so bizarre. And this is our philosophical heritage. This is the postmodern problem. Once you reject a correspondence theory of truth, it becomes difficult to make any substantive appeal to truth, knowledge, or reason, let alone justice, whatever that is supposed to mean. This is the problem of postmodern epistemology. Trying to make epistemic sense of the world from a deconstructed worldview is a lot like trying to nail Jell-O to the wall. There is no truth, only perspective, except for this truth, attempting to adjust or enlighten your perspective to see things more clearly. I trust you see the problem. So, to grossly oversimplify the history of a complex discipline that is philosophy, the driving question, not the only question, but the driving question of the classical quest for wisdom seems to have been, what can we know? What is there? With the rise of the Enlightenment, the driving questions became, how can we know what we know? How can we know that we know? The postmodern answer is, well, what do we know? Or there is nothing there to know, or we could never know it. So let's just share our stories, our perspectives, rather than asserting that certain stories or narratives have morals or overarching truths. Despite its popularity, epistemological relativism is devastating for ethics, politics, and the meaning of life. If there is no truth, no justice, no goodness to be known, how shall we then live? Some believe that social progress is possible without an objective standard of truth, and that justice is achievable. Do you believe this? Or is it possible that these skeptics of universal objective truth are not really skeptical enough? If you disagree with the claims of postmodernism, then how shall you deal with it? Perhaps your philosophical journey will encounter the answers. Of course, the epistemic question remains. If you did encounter truth or the answers, would you know it? How would you know it? Hopefully you can see both valuable and problematic points within both traditions of thought. I also hope you see now the difference between methodology and ideology, and that you don't have to demonize a methodology simply because you disagree with the ideology or take issue with certain points within an ideology. Note, by the way, that we used a critical methodology to scrutinize and critique the critical ideology. Clearly, there is much for us to think about when it comes to our claims on truth and claiming to know what we know we know. This concludes our 4-week study in epistemology. Next week we move on to metaphysics.